Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of An Englishman, an Irishman, and a Load of Bollocks. I'm Dave, and as ever, I'm joined by Paul. And today's subject, we're going to talk about comedy. So we're going to get into that in a minute. It's going to be a little bit more lighthearted than a couple of our previous podcasts, but we hope you enjoy it nonetheless. Just before we start, and before I bring Paul in, I didn't know we were already on Apple and Google as well as Spotify. So I'm going to drop the links when I upload this podcast. I'm going to drop the links where you can listen to us on Google and Apple. So if you're watching this on YouTube, the link to the Spotify podcast or on Google or Apple will all be there, because there may have been people who've not been able to listen to us because they didn't know they could listen to us on those platforms, but apparently we are on those platforms, which is great. So I'm going to link to Spotify, Google, and Apple, and of course you'll be able to continue to listen and watch us going forward on YouTube as well. So just get that out of the way. Hope everyone's well. I'm going to bring in Paul, and Paul, you can open the podcast. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good, Dave. How are you? I'm actually sitting up in my bed. I'm actually sitting up in my bed here, having a cup of tea, as far away from the kids as possible. So life is good. I can't complain. Yeah. How are you?
Bit of an oasis of calm for you for an hour or so, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, good stuff.
Yeah,
good
we
stuff.
said we are going to talk about comedy. So yeah, I don't mind starting off.
Yeah, go for it.
I was
Paul.
kind of thinking, I suppose, that before we delve into the world of comedy, it kind of got me thinking about my own childhood and my own upbringing and the importance of humor and laughter growing up. Because I am blessed and lucky that I grew up in a household where my parents had a wonderful sense of humor. They still do. My poor father obviously passed away. My mother's still alive, but both had a great sense of humor. My father was very funny, very witty, great to tell a yarn, and obviously had that great Irish trait of he could take the piss. He was brilliant at mockery. He was great at ridicule, but obviously everything was in good jest. And then also, growing up, my parents had a good sense of humor, good taste in humor. I grew up watching the great Dave Allen. May your God be with you. I grew up watching Neil Tubeen. A lot of Irish people would know the great storyteller Neil Tubeen. I grew up watching Spike Milligan, Monty Python, the great Tommy Cooper. My God, my parents loved Tommy Cooper, and they loved Bernard Manning. My father loved Joan Rivers as well. So there was a great school of education there in terms of comedy. And then it kind of got me thinking as well about the importance of comedy, that it's no surprise that a kind of a funny, carefree childhood is in many ways a happy childhood. And that goes vice versa, doesn't it? And then I think of myself with Lisa. You know, me and Lisa within our household, you know, we try not to take ourselves too seriously with the kids. We try to have a laugh with the kids all the time. So yeah, comedy is so important, not just societal, but also within the family home. And it kind of got me thinking about that quote. Isn't there a famous quote with George Orwell that every joke is a little revolution? You know, and jokes can hold power. They can, you know, be revolutionary. But unfortunately, in the recent world, every joke now is carefully said, so not to upset the snowflakes, they constantly offend it. And it's such a shame, you know. But what I love about comedy, that it should be in many ways safe. It's a sacred craft. It should be a safe refuge for freedom of speech, but unfortunately, it isn't. It should be a place where there's not enough limits, that no matter, every topic should be discussed, no matter how dark it is, you know. And you'd like to think, Dave, but unfortunately, we don't live in a so-called liberal democratic society. Comedy should be flourishing more than ever, with all the comedy we see every day, with Ukraine, Russia, with climate change, with COVID. There's so much comedy value there, you know. So it should be flourishing. But comedy should be unpredictable. It should be edgy. It should be dark. It should be, and more importantly, it should be uncensored. But unfortunately, cancel culture is alive and well. So I'm probably not seeing the true value of comedy now compared to the heydays of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where comedy was brilliant.
Yeah, a good introduction, that, Paul. Multi-layered introduction. we were saying before we started the podcast that we could probably do 4 or 5 episodes on talking comedy, and I think
Yeah,
it's such a deep subject to tackle, comedy, when you start analysing it and you start looking into what is comedy, why is it so important? Um, for me, life itself, existence itself, it's defined more than anything else by two entities. One is tragedy, and the
yeah,
other is comedy. And I think that's why all the great writers understand this. If you think, for example, a lot of Shakespeare's plays were tragicomedies. A lot of characters
yeah,
in sitcoms are tragicomedic, aren't they? Characters. The two, you can't have one without the other. You have to have. They go together. They juxtapose because that is life. There's always an element of tragedy to a comedic situation because there's always a victim.
yeah,
And likewise, you have to, because otherwise, what would be the point in our existence, in our life? You have to somehow see the comedy in every tragic situation. It's only that ultimately
yeah,
that gets you through. And it's interesting you were talking about your upbringing. Same with me, lightheartedness, comedy, openness, and a
yeah.
relatively large Overton window as well. And obviously, I come from a city, Liverpool, that's known for its comedy,
It is,
has a
yeah,
reputation for funny men, and for there's
yeah,
a real strand of humor that runs through the people, and there's probably a little bit of truth to that. And then you touched on how comedy's essentially been sanitized, hasn't it? I'd say in the
yeah,
last 10 years, and it's
yeah,
happened at a rate of knots so quickly. It's absolutely terrifying. I
yeah,
understand why it's happened,
yeah,
because it goes hand in hand with totalitarianism. So if you believe that we are living under totalitarianism, which some of us do, I certainly do, then the erosion of comedy, alongside the erosion of anything that lends itself to ingenuity, to creativity, to levity, um, you have to erode away those entities, and
yeah,
that's exactly what's happened. And primarily with comedy, I think it's the number one target for the Tyrants is comedy,
yeah,
because comedy shines a light on the absolute ludicrous nature of the totalitarian regime. And whether we're talking about the unbelievable things in relation to COVID, as you say, Ukraine, Russia, climate change, all the race baiting that's going on, everything else, the absolute ludicrousness and insanity of the world in which we live, we need comedians to be able to show, or not even comedians, we need everyday citizens to be able to shine a light
exactly.
on the utter insanity. So there's a reason why comedians are
Yeah.
cancelled, and cancel culture is real. So yeah, that would be my introduction.
You mentioned the way like comedy is sanitized now, and someone that's constantly talking about cancel culture, and he's obviously a comedic legend, is John Cleese.
Hmm.
And he said something like recently, I saw him in an interview, I think it could have been GB News, and he's been constantly talking about this, the importance of comedy and how it's sanitized and how it's weaponized recently. That cancel culture, in many ways, is it's the death of creativity and comedy. And that makes a lot of sense because, imagine a comedian now having to think about what he has to say, what he or her has to say on the comedy stage. They're they're looking over their shoulder for fear of offending someone. Sure, that's not comedy.
No.
You know, it's like a 1984 Orwellian version of comedy. But in many ways, I think with comedy now, does you talked about how comedy is sanitized, it's bland, it's mediocre, it's. But is comedy maybe now, Dave, a snapshot of society? It's a snapshot of where we are in the world. So you have comedy, and let's have comedy and the modern world in one hand. It's bland, it's mediocre,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's soulless, it's contrived, it's weak, and
Yeah.
it's cowardly. And it's all about filling. Comedy now is filling quotas over filling our hearts with laughter in many ways, isn't it? And I was thinking as well that I'm sure we both like comedy, and the biggest comedy festival nowadays is what's the one? It's the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, can you imagine what that festival is like now? So, one of my friends said to me there recently, he said, it's not the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, it's the Edinburgh Cringe Festival. It's just woke. It's
Yeah.
it's woke. It's just wokeness, and it's
Yeah.
comedies going around the circuit who are they're left wing activists, they're
Yeah.
climate activists, they're mental health advocates, they're establishment lackeys. You know, that's what comedy is now. And then
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, even in terms of people I used to like and how they've sold out. I'm sure you used to look at Mock the Week. Frankie Boyle used to be funny.
Yeah.
Um,
He's the
we in
ultimate
our
sellout, the ultimate
oh,
hypocrite.
he,
Unbelievable.
he,
Unbelievable.
Dave, he's a larping, isn't that the word? He's a larper,
Yeah.
larping.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
a guy, we have a guy in Ireland called Tommy Tiernan, exactly the same. You know, these fellas, they think they're edgy. They, you know, I put it up to the man by being a little compliant little boy.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they know which side their bread is buttered. You know, but they're weak cowards, really, those guys. And that's their legacy, is that they've sold out. All because they get on mainstream TV. Like as you say, Frankie Boyle, he's sold out so much. You know, is it worth it?
Yeah. We've talked extensively, haven't we, Paul, about how the there's so many angles to this. Actually, first of all, the subversives and the rebellious types in society, they are not in the areas that you would expect them to be,
Yeah,
i.e., the students and
yeah,
the what you would term the arts as
yeah,
well, the arts types. Now, it's my belief that every institution and every area of public life has somewhat been or completely infiltrated by woke, let's call it wokeism,
yeah.
neo-Marxism, that extreme left-wing ideology. And you were talking about the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and you can imagine what it's like there, can't you? There in August,
Oh,
and the
Jesus.
tourists there, and there's someone on a soapbox. They've got the green hair. They're flying the Ukraine flag.
Yeah,
They've got their badge with the pride colours, the
yeah,
LGBT alphabet people stuff, and they're telling jokes about the Tories and Brexit. And that to
yeah,
them,
yeah,
I think they
yeah,
genuinely think that
yeah.
they are being subversive, that they are being
That they're
controversial,
edgy. Yeah,
that they're edgy, but they're not. And that's the irony of
yeah,
ironies, is that
yeah,
the very
yeah.
people who should be the
I know.
ones
Yeah,
who take that responsibility to
yeah,
challenge the establishment, who are the comedians, who are the artists,
yeah,
who are the writers,
yeah, yeah,
but particularly the comedians aren't,
yeah,
which is why you end up with such a sanitized brand of comedy of left-wing comedians whose sole aim really is self-validation, to tell the jokes that their left-wing audiences want to hear, that are within the very
yeah,
narrow Overton window of what's been deemed acceptable by the regime. And
yeah,
that's where we are. So you tell jokes
yeah.
about Tories, you can tell jokes about Brexit voters, you can tell jokes about Trump voters. But if you want to branch out into
Mm.
into the types of material that we discuss, well, no, then you'll be branded the usual terms, right wing extremists and all the rest of it.
100%.
But that's where we are. So now,
Yeah,
actually, the responsibility is falling on to take on the powerful
yeah,
establishment. It's falling on people
yeah,
like me and you, Paul, like with this podcast.
yeah.
So how
Do,
um,
do,
how insane is that?
do you remember, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the heydays of music and
Yeah,
uh, comedy, where you did have like rebels who
Bernard
it was all
Manning.
about their mantra. Their mantra was you stick it to the man. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
through
yeah, yeah,
comedy,
yeah.
through the music. You know, you think of people like Bowie in music and Bill Hicks and Carlin in comedy, people like that. But now, as you say, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Edinburgh Fringe Festival is not stick it to the man, it's stick it in my arm. That's what it is now.
Yeah, I like that, Paul. Yeah, that's a very telling
Yeah.
uh, telling indictment. Actually,
They
it
can't get
really
enough
is.
of daddy government because daddy government
Absolutely
pays their
owned.
wage.
Yeah, absolutely owned and spineless. And the thing is, as well, with comedy, much as in the same with anything creative. I mean, Paul, if you were told, if you like to write, and obviously we both like to do these podcasts. I've got my
Yeah.
book and my YouTube channel. They all involve creativity and unbounded kind of like thinking. Really, there's nothing off limits. If you were told by a boss or whoever it was. Right, okay, so you've got your audience. We want you to perform, or we want you to write something, but you've got to do it within this very narrow window. I mean, how would you really be able to create your way to something that is going to be of true value when the parameters and the boundaries are that tight? For me, particularly when it comes to comedy, which is there always has to be a victim in comedy, always.
Yeah.
Right? You can't have comedy without there being a victim. If you take those boundaries and make them ever narrower and ever narrower and ever narrower, by default, you are going to become less and less and less funny. You're going to become more and more and more predictable and more and more and more stale. And comedy itself, if that's what's happening, both in the large theatres and on the comedy circuit in smaller venues, as well as in life in general as well, comedy is going to die.
It is. Imagine having comedy, as you say, Dave, where there's terms and conditions. I mean, there's only going to be one result, which is empty rooms watching you, because it's diluted, it's sanitized, it's bland. It's just again, the common theme in what we've discussed the last 2-3 years is just there's so many cowards. They're everywhere, and there's so many cowards within the comedy circuit. But as you say, they have this belief that they're anti-establishment, and they're far from it.
I think another thing as well you mentioned there, Paul, about the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. So let's go back to those 4 decades, which were certainly produced some incredible music, and there was an explosion of creativity within the arts generally. Certainly within the UK, there was. There were certain cities within the UK, London, Manchester, Liverpool, where there was a real explosion of musical creativity. A lot of those creators and musicians who kind of defined that time, particularly say the 60s, which was a time of free-spirited kind of creativity.
Carnaby Street and
all that. But so many of those characters have shown themselves. They're not anti-establishment at all. They're not rebellious at all. Because
look at the Rolling Stones.
Look at the Stones. In fact, it's easier to go through and give the names of the individuals within the arts who actually have stood out and said, no, I'm not going to play along with this game. So even though those times are looked upon as one of freedom and unbridled creativity, and as you say, sticking it to the man, it's easy to stick it to the man when times are good, Paul, isn't it? When times
and when you have money,
when times are tough, who's going to still stick it to the man? Well, tell you what, hardly any of them have they? So,
Ian Brown, Van Morrison,
Morrissey,
Morrissey didn't say anything.
That's about it, really. That's about it, isn't it? That's about it. I mean, in the meantime, you've got the likes of McCartney there, flying his Ukraine flag at Glastonbury. I mean, it's just pathetic, isn't it? It's absolutely pathetic. But going back to comedy, Paul, sorry, go on after you. Sorry,
I'm just going to say, we're probably cynical at comedy, and rightfully so, but it also is important, and we have seen some really good aspects of comedy. I think our side, if you want to call it our side, if you want to call it centre right, whatever that means, we do memes have been brilliant. I think memes. We do memes. We win the gold in memes. The left can't do memes. They don't have that humor. They don't have that intelligence to do memes. Memes have been wonderful to get messages across. And then I was thinking as well of the importance of satire, because satire is wonderful at poking fun at. It pokes fun. Satire can take the piss. It pokes fun and ridicules dictatorships, tyrannies, leaders, governments. And I think of someone like Bob Moran, the cartoon satirist, absolutely brilliant. His pictures have gone worldwide, and it's always irony and satire, and he really gets his message across. And then I was talking about that comedy can be important. Do you remember I can't remember which year it was, the Charlie Hebdo killings?
It was about 2015, I think. Something like that,
And and it was classic French cartoonists. The French have their own very brilliant sense of humor in terms of satire, and the famous don't mind my French pronunciation here, J. Sweet Charlie. Everyone's wearing the baseball caps and the placards. That was brilliant. That was like a show of strength against the Islamic terrorists. That we in the Western world, we value the importance of comedy. We value the importance of ridicule and mockery, and we value the importance of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So humor can be powerful. And I even think in an Irish context that we've had some wonderful comedies in this country, but we don't have them anymore. Like Savage Eye used to be a comedy in Ireland, the great Dave McSavage. And that used to take aim at everyone in the country. Britain, you had Spitting Image, Brass Eye, which they kind of were close to the bone, weren't they? They used to break boundaries, So, I mean, hopefully we can reestablish these comedies again, possibly.
Yeah, you make a great point about the memes, actually. And what comes to mind there is a picture says 1,000 words, and that's a reference to the power of art as well, which is something else that's possibly been denigrated as well. But you mentioned Bob Moran, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but
British people used to always say Kevin Moran, the footballer, Kevin Moran.
Is it? Yeah. His are so cutting, and I mentioned the start about tragicomedy. The way he's able to address the most serious, horrific issues with a little touch of comedy in there to make his point, whilst at the same time mocking either the tyrants or the people who've obeyed the tyrants' orders, or both together. Now, I think his most recent one, I think it's the last one I've seen actually, was a picture of at the top of the picture was a witch burning kind of event, obviously a nod to the Middle Ages, the witch trials, and then on the bottom, kind of like the fire had burnt out, and the people responsible, the witch hunters, simply said, "Oh, we're sorry, mistakes were made on both sides," as if to say, we just need to move on from this now. I mean, such a dark message with a historical precedent that we know what he's talking about when it comes to the present day, don't we? And a nod to the lunacy of what's happened, and the lunacy of how the totalitarians, the tyrants, their lackeys, the population in general, seem to be content to just move away and let it slide into historical obscurity. So absolutely the power of memes. And you said as well about how the left can't meme. The left can't meme, or the modern left can't meme, because they can't laugh.
Yeah.
Because they don't know what comedy is, so that's why they can't do it.
No. And it reminds me of that quote, isn't there? I can't remember who said it, about it's important to keep fighting for freedom and justices, but don't forget to have fun doing it as well.
Yeah. I have to tell myself that sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. That,
Absolutely. You still there, Paul?
Yeah, I'm still there. Sorry.
Sorry about that.
Right. 1 second. Sorry.
No worries. I was going to ask you
That's the the scene when the guy in the BBC doing the interview and the child comes in the background. I had that moment there now.
Just to lever them out the way slowly and gently.
The hand is saying, yeah.
Just gently pushing them away. I was going to ask you a question then, Paul, about about what comedies you watched when you were growing up, and maybe some favourite characters, because there's been some classics, haven't there, in the 80s and 90s?
We could do another episode just based on this, and I'll ask you the same question as well. Just off the top of my head, there's one person that and unfortunately he died a few years ago. I loved Rick Mail. I loved Rick Mail, and I loved him the young ones, and I loved him at Bottom, but he did some great movies as well, and he was in a famous one by One. It's well worth looking at, and I remember he had a famous kind of speech about 9/11, and he was on the ball. He was astute. He was aware of what was going on. He knew about the dark forces, and that was like, he died about 10 years ago. I loved Rick Mail. I loved Gene Wilder. One of my favorite movies is him and Richard Pryor. What's it called? See No Evil, Hear No Evil. and as I said, I grew up in a household with all those comedians that I mentioned at the start, and I used to love the Fast Show and Harry Enfield, and obviously being Irish, Father Ted, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's important, and even with us, we like watching The Simpsons. I think it's good, lighthearted for the kids. How about yourself?
Oh, so many, Paul.
There is so many.
Yeah, so many. I mean, probably my all-time favorite, like my second family, is Only Fools and Horses.
Brilliant.
Only Fools and Horses, and then I'll tell you who I love. Tell you which character I love. In One Foot in the Grave is Victor Meldrew, because I sometimes look back at comedies from the 90s, and you can just see little references to how the world was changing. And I think Victor Meldrew, very, very cleverly, how they portrayed and how they created and portrayed that character of a Britain that was starting to change and move away from kind of like a more kind of like innocent community spirited time to one where maybe sort of some poorer values were starting to creep in. And there you had poor old Victor Meldrew, who was a cantankerous old man, bit of a grump, but his heart was in the right place. And he was aghast. Every episode, there'd be something that he was aghast at what he was seeing in the world that he thought was fundamentally wrong. And there was a real sadness to One Foot in the Grave that was reflected primarily through his character. Even though he was absolutely hilarious, there was a real kind of like, and when I look back now, I think the writers were seeing a Britain, were seeing a world, were seeing a society that was starting to degrade somewhat. And Victor Meldrew, he saw that, and his struggles and his his scrapes that he got into, and the things
lockdowns wouldn't have suited him, would it, Dave?
What's that?
Lockdowns wouldn't have suited him.
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. Definitely not. No. But then I looked to something that probably the most recent comedy, or one of the most recent comedies that I've watched that are still classed as like really funny, is The In-Betweeners. That was only made 10, 12 years ago. Would The In-Betweeners be commissioned now, a matter of a decade later? I don't think so.
Hard to know. Things have just moved so fast.
Yeah.
I was kind of thinking as well, a character I like in The In-Betweeners, and he's not one of the main characters. I love Jay's father. I think Jay's father is, I mean, we were talking about,
he's horrible, isn't he? He's
horrible, but he speaks the truth. He speaks the truth. He doesn't sugarcoat it. You could, he just says what's on his mind, and there's no airs or graces. He just says it as it is, and I think he's funny.
Yeah. Oh, he's good. You mentioned Father Ted as well, Paul. I know we've talked a little bit about Father Ted between us. How would you say Father Ted? I think you made the point that there was possibly just a small kind of like window of opportunity for Father Ted to be commissioned and to go ahead and to be brought to the masses and to be accepted, and possibly beforehand they would never have got away with it, and certainly now they would never have got away. A little bit more on that.
The timing when it was made was absolutely perfect, and obviously it didn't get the go ahead through RTE. It was obviously commissioned by Channel 4. So that just shows it was an Irish comedy, but British made. There was a window of opportunity there where obviously it would never have been made in the 70s, 80s, 90s because of, you would have had the Catholic Church saying, not a chance that you're going to, it'd be mockery, So it was made in the mid 90s. And was there 2 series, a lot of great comedies. There was only 2 or 3 series made.
Yeah.
And obviously Dermot Morgan died as well, unfortunately. But it was just perfect timing, because not long after Father Ted was made, we're talking about 96, 97 here, possibly 98, a lot of the child abuse scandals were coming out. They were coming to the surface. So we're talking about abuse scandals that were coming out from Ferns down in Wexford, Father Comiskey, and obviously, the whole focus was on the Catholic Church and the scandals involved in the church. So you can imagine it'd be bad taste if Father Ted would have been made around that time. So in ways there was an innocence as well when Father Ted was made. Just talking about Father Ted as well, that the Graham Linehan, one of the writers of the Father Ted, he's been wonderful in standing up against cancer culture, standing
Brilliant.
up against transgenderism as well. The woke crowd went for him, but he's not backing down, so he's got a bit of a backbone. The writer of Father Ted, Graham Linehan, him and J.K. Rowling, have been stalwarts in standing up to the mob.
Yeah, absolutely. We were really talking last night, weren't we, about how it's, despite our, as you say, our cynicism and our criticism, there are characters in both of our countries across the sectors who have really,
Yeah.
really, really stood up, and they're to be celebrated. But just going back to comedy itself, the comedians are the canaries in the coal mine, aren't they? And
Brilliant. Yeah.
I think the danger signs really started presenting maybe back as far as maybe 2014, 2015, 2016, when what we term wokeness started to show itself for the very, very insidious and malevolent force that it was. That was when we started seeing universities and student unions cancelling comedians. That was a very, very early sign, I think, Paul, that something was badly amiss here. Because if comedians don't have free speech, unbridled, unfettered free speech, then nobody has. It's almost sacrosanct for a comedian to be able to go on that stage and say what the hell he wants. You go and say the most despicable, horrible things about whoever you want to say it about. So long as you're not calling for violence, you have unfettered free speech, and you are the canary in the coal mine. And if you have the opportunity to be able to go and deliver your brand of comedy, then not only you have got a problem, but the whole of society's got a problem. And lo and behold, in 2023, with the mass cancellations that are happening everywhere, not just in comedic circles, lo and behold, the signs were there, weren't they? Years ago.
You think of, like, you're talking about, like, Father Ted. It was just perfect timing. It was the right place at the right time. And I think of someone like, let's just talk about Bernard Manning. Wasn't he just a comedy? If the right man at the right time, working man's clubs around the Manchester area, the northwest of England, and he did his thing, and he brought so much joy and laughter to people in England, and especially the north of England. And he was a very intelligent man, and he knew how to play. He played a character as well. And he looked funny, and he talked funny. He looked so funny, big fat round face, and he'd always wear a shirt. And but if he was around now, he wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes, and and the world would be, would never have experienced the Bernard Manning experience. But he was perfect timing that the world was able to have people like him. Because as you say now, if anyone goes off the radar or it goes off the script, they're just instantly cancelled and they're never seen again. Which is a shame, because if I want to go to a comedy show, the edgier, the darker, the bluer, the better.
Yeah, Bernard Manning, you talked about the timing of Bernard Manning and the era. He's just in the right era, and thank God there's people who've got video footage of him, so we can still watch his amazing comedy, even though he's no longer with us and would not be accepted today anyway. But it was also, you talking about the timing, his comedy timing, absolutely impeccable, unbelievable. Oh, absolutely, the way he's able to deliver his lines and his jokes, he has me in tears. I absolutely love Bernard Manning, and because there's no exceptions, he happily said. One thing that made me laugh about Bernard Manning, though, do you know the only two topics that he'd never tackle? So he'd have a go at everyone and anything, right, which is great, apart from disabled people and tampons. I don't know, like, that's bizarre, isn't it? That makes me laugh.
Well, Jo Brand used to talk about tampons and periods, didn't she? Jo Brand was actually okay.
Yeah, although I think she got co-opted.
She's a bit of a lefty.
I think she did. I mean, it's such a shame as well, the way comedy's been kind of redefined. As you've got right-wing comedy, which is largely unacceptable these days, and left-wing comedy. For me, a political angle in comedy is pretty boring anyway. Comedy. the best
Yeah,
comedy for me
yeah,
is around
yeah,
observations and culture and people, not
yeah,
really politics, but it's
yeah,
symptomatic of how everything else in
yeah.
society has become
Yeah, and
politicized.
comedy should be challenging. It should bring out
Challenging.
emotion.
Yeah, yeah,
It should break down boundaries. But as we see with comedy now, it's bland, it's plain, it's mediocre. It's like
yeah,
comedian is Michael McIntyre. A
yeah.
safe pair of hands.
Yeah.
You go and watch them, and it'd be like it's humor for children. You know.
And you've got the likes of when I think of the archetype, sorry, the stereotype of the best example maybe of like kind of like the establishment owned comedian. You mentioned the MASH report before. It would be Nish Kumar, and I watch
Oh,
I
Jesus.
watch him and I think, I tell you what, you should be getting you under the Trade Description Act. You call yourself a comedian. You're nothing more than a mouthpiece for the regime. That's all he is. Same material recycled over and over and over and over and over again. That all of his colleagues are doing, recycling their jokes over and over and over
Yeah.
again about the same
They keep pumping them out, don't they?
over and over and over again. It's so boring. It's so
Yeah.
incredibly stale and boring. And just there's nothing edgy, there's nothing funny about it at all. So we certainly, as I've talked a lot about kind of like an intellectual and moral rebellion that's simmering beneath the surface. And part of that, I think, is is a renaissance in true comedy, which is, unbridled comedy underpinned by free speech and the ability to challenge authority. 2 minutes left, Paul. I'll let you go out on it on whatever you want to say.
Yeah, I think we could do a part two. We were
Yeah,
thinking, weren't we? And I think what do you think when we do a part two around? We were thinking, guys, and anyone that's listening to us, feel free to maybe give us some ideas. We were thinking doing a part two, weren't we, Dave, of maybe possible comedy heroes and what would their take have been on lockdowns and masks. So, for instance, what would Del Boy have done
yeah,
during the lockdown? But
yeah,
yeah, I enjoyed the chat, and yeah, it was good. I was kind of thinking as well. I love Bill Hicks, and
yeah.
the famous Bill Hicks one about life. Life is like an amusement ride. There's ups and downs, so let's just enjoy the ride, guys. Isn't that it?
Yeah, I like it. And what you were just saying then as well, I was just imagining John Cleese's Faulty Towers having to abide by the COVID measures. Can you imagine? Can you
In
imagine
a hotel.
that? Oh, so
Yeah,
we'll do a part two. Or definitely do a part two on
on
imagining
that
what
maybe.
these comedy heroes, how they would have reacted
Yeah,
to.
yeah. How David Brent got on with COVID?
Oh,
There'd be loads of fanfare.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Or Chris Finch, Gareth Keenan investigates.
Oh, he would have loved it, wouldn't he? He would have loved it.
Oh, he would have. He would have had Jack boots on.
He would have.
Yeah.
Well, we've got less than a minute left, Paul, so I'm going to wind it up if that's okay with you. As Paul said, any suggestions, or if anyone's got any comments on what we've talked about today, feel free to drop them in the comment section, wherever you're watching this or listening to it. And we'll be back soon, Paul, won't we? With well, I think I don't know what we're doing next, but I'm sure we'll do another one on comedy soon, a follow up to this. So great chatting as ever, Paul.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. That was good. Yeah.
Good.
As you said, there's so many angles to approach it, isn't there?
Yeah, and thanks everyone for listening as well. And we'll be back very, very soon. So I'm going to wind it up because we're about to get cut off. So speak to you soon, Paul. And thanks again, everybody, for listening.
Yeah. Thanks.
Cheers.